So, Dan, here we are with our podcast, episode 1, Family Secrets of the Spanish Civil War. And what's, I think, powerful about this episode is our encounters with our relatives kind of on paper, these almost ghostly presence of their memory on paper that hits us in different ways. Me with a letter to my mother from my grandfather, and you in a bookstore in New York City around the same time.
It wasn't until 1968 when I found this book, Arthur Landis's The Abraham Lincoln Brigade, that I found a reference to Ben Barsky, my mother's brother. And it wasn't until some years later, 1975, that my aunt gave me an old cigar box full of letters written by her two cousins in Spain. And so, my point here is that the paper came second.
Yeah.
Before the paper was the stories and the sense of mystery about it, really.
Well, Dan, here we are talking about U.S. and European history some 35 years after I was your student at Mount Holyoke College.
Yes.
And I'm struck by a memory from one of my first days on campus when I first met you. I remember your first words to me at one of these like freshman get-together, meet the faculty events. I'm sure you've done a million of them. And I remember coming up to you like all eager and saying, "Hi, I've taken all this AP history in high school. Should I start studying history at the 100 level or the 200 level?" And I think you were kindly refrained from rolling your eyes. You've been to that rodeo with the eager freshman student. And you just looked at me very calmly and you said, "Do you really think you know that stuff?" And, I didn't take it in a hurtful way at all. I just took it as, yeah, you have an opportunity to start fresh in a way and start from square one, and don't be in such a rush and take your time. So I guess I want to just thank you for that. And I just marvel at where this journey has taken us as we begin to talk about these two books we've written.
Yes. Well, back in the day, AP history really had a meaning. These days, everybody takes AP history, and they don't come in knowing all that much. So, I appreciated then and now your eagerness and willingness to learn. And you're also understanding that you didn't really know that much, but you're really eager to learn more. And so that's really what I think was great about you as a student, among other things, Patty. I think that, yeah, go ahead.
Well, interestingly, I only took AP European. They only offered European AP in my high school.
It was very rare.
And I wound up, as you might recall, American Studies major. But here we are talking about European history. And,
Yes.
I think one of the many things that has landed us here is our shared immigrant family stories.
Yes, and of course, American history is much more capacious these days than it was 40 or 50 years ago. And the connections between the American past and the European past, I think, are much clearer than they were certainly when I was starting out as an historian and you were an undergraduate student here at Mount Holyoke. But one of the events that was so crucial in my own family, and certainly in yours as well, was the Spanish Civil War. And that's what we're going to focus on here. We both have deep family connections to Spain. I had several family members who fought in the Spanish Civil War with the international brigades. Two of them never came home.
Amazing.
One of them came home badly wounded and later died in the Merchant Marine in World War II. And the struggle against fascism was a central part of my family's identity. And so, separating European and American history, it's really an artificial distinction in some ways, and certainly was for people in the 1930s, who I think looked at the struggle against fascism as a global one,
Right.
and one that had to be international in scope. So, yes, it's what's happening in Spain, but what's happening in Spain has an enormous impact on Europe and the rest of the world.
Right. Right. And my mother came here in the late 1950s, sort of escaping fascism after the fascists won in 1939. And yet there's so much explaining to do about the way the war um, not just disrupted, but in some ways destroyed my mother's family, even though they were non-combatants.
Right. People
But
sometimes ask me, and I'm sure you get this too, Patty, why'd you write this book? What drove you to spend all these years and all this time digging away, writing away? And I have an epigraph, a quote that I wanted to share from Karl Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which he wrote in 1852. And the quote goes like this: people make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. A tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Uh, and I'm not sure, for me, it's a nightmare, but it's certainly been weighing on my brain for a long time. And this book offered me an opportunity. Really, I was compelled to try to learn more about the lives of these people, most of whom I never knew, but heard about over the kitchen table.
right.
And so the title of my book, Kitchen Table History, really speaks to my desire to really look at that kitchen table history, by which I mean the stories, the characters, the tales that I heard over the kitchen table about things that one never learned about in school, that one never learned about over TV, that one never learned about in any kind of uh, way except within the family. And the great tension for me throughout this project has been, on the one hand, kitchen table history, you know, tells you to listen closely to what people are telling you, and to value the stories and narratives you hear. But on the other hand, kitchen table history is also full of silences, repressed memories, a desire to forget. And so the task of pulling out the history from people, and also the task of looking at history versus memory,
Yeah.
is a big part of this challenge. As
Yeah.
a fellow historian of mine has once put it, history is the enemy of memory. And I've
Wow.
I've
Yeah.
brooded about that for a long time.
Wow. Yeah, and memory is a big driver for me. It's about really about my mother, memories of my mother, and how her challenge to cope with loss, being here in the US as her family members um, succumbed to one malady or challenge or another at a great distance. And, somebody once said to me, wise words, I think, is like one kid in every generation gets all the stories. And it becomes their task. They become the carriers and keepers of the memories. The ghosts get to haunt them particularly. And I really feel I am a bit haunted as I tackled this book. I started it once my mother had become quite ill in 2015 to be exact, and I lost her before I finished it. So that's definitely a piece of this puzzle, to tell the Spanish story of my family that otherwise is going to be lost in the busyness of and present and future minded United States. And the memory that really is the driver here is I'm the only person of my sibs and my dad and everybody in our house growing up in Westchester County in the 60s, who witnessed the receipt of a letter my mother got from her father in the spring of 1970, which announced her mother's death. And I'll never forget that day. I was 5 or 6 years old. I think I was 6. Yeah, I was 64, so I was 6. And it's a warm summer day, and it's a very clear, if short, memory of being in our living room with the sun streaming in, this big east picture window, and my mother opening the morning mail, sitting in a chair and reading this letter, and throwing herself on the floor in agony. And as a child, being terrified by seeing my mother prostrate, and me sort of leaping back in fear, jumping up on the living room couch. And it's just it's sort of a frozen moment. I'm the only one who has this memory in my family. And, she had learned of her mother's death about a few weeks earlier. She'd already been buried. And just the agony of that moment has been burned in me for a very long time. And I actually have the letter. And so I know what it said. And what it said, in part, was that her mother suffered greatly. She did not have an easy death. She suffered from seizures and a lack of health care. Doctors wouldn't really take care of her because she was kind of a lost cause to them. And so there's a real agony in the letter that she received. And then there's this little postscript at the bottom where my grandfather confesses that he's himself been very ill. He can't even put on his pants by himself. I mean, they're older at this point, but she just got this terrible news, and she had just given birth to her third child, my brother Kenny, who was 3 months old. And so she's got these 3 little kids, and she's in this house in northern Westchester suburbs, and her mother has died, and she can't do anything about it. She's just pierced with this agony. And that's my memory, and that's a big driver for me in this book. What happened?
Listening to you talk about that particular story with your, the death and the impact it had, it reminds me again of another aphorism, which is that history is what hurts. And for me, there were a series of questions driving me throughout this project that not only about what hurt, but also, questions about why people made decisions they made. Why did some people emigrate from the old country and other people did not? Why did some family members organize their lives around political movements to create a more just society, while others ignored politics and simply focused on material success? And throughout this project, I have tried my best to answer those questions, but it's really humbling to realize ultimately that you can't. That you can get at best incomplete answers to these questions. And historians, I think, are always struggling to understand why individuals did what they did. On some level, you can talk about generalities, you can talk about the push for immigration, you can talk about the impact of a war, you can talk about the impact of the Great Depression, and so on. But in the end, you cannot account for why individuals do what they did, in many cases, quite the opposite of what their siblings might have done or their best friends might have done. And that's part of the puzzle that you're trying to piece together.
Yeah. I mean, I feel so, embarrassed that I didn't know you had relatives that served in Spain until, we connected this past summer. And, I think the way you've shared it with me, and I perhaps as a driver too, is that you're carrying some family grief about losing these very close kin.
I mean, there's a story that I tell in the book. I was in 10th grade in high school, and I had to give my first oral book report. I was extremely nervous. And the book I had chosen was a book called The Wound in the Heart by the historian Alan Gutmann, which was about America and the Spanish Civil War. Now, I had heard a lot about the Spanish Civil War as a kid. I heard stories of people, some people anyway, others not so much. But the point is that at the age of 14, I was already trying to wrestle with this stuff. I thought this was a great topic. I expected all my classmates to be interested in it, and of course, they were more interested in the Beatles and popular culture. I mean, I dug the Beatles too, but I was sort of driven to deal with this question of Spanish Civil War. And the next moment where this really came home for me was in 1968. I was a freshman at college at SUNY Binghamton, and I was home on Christmas break. And I went with my dad to a local bookstore in the Bronx, and I saw a new book that had just come out by Arthur Landis called The Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was the first ever sort of serious study of the Lincoln Brigade. That is the American volunteers. There were 2,800 or so who were part of the larger group of some 40,000 international volunteers who came to the aid of the Spanish Republic during the Civil War. At any rate, I looked at this book, and my father had had two cousins that were in Spain, two brothers, and they were fairly well known. They were kind of celebrated in the literature. Uh, and my mother also had a brother who was killed in Spain, and we knew nothing about him. In fact, when he died in 1938, as we later discovered, his parents, my grandparents, never got any notification of his death. There was nothing certainly from the U.S. State Department or the Department of the Army. It was illegal to be in Spain. There was a great mystery about this guy, Ben Barsky. What had happened to him? At any rate, I'm in that bookstore and looking in the index of this book, and there's a reference to him in the index, Ben Barsky, death of. I quickly turn the pages and I see a brief account from somebody's diary of his death. And I was very excited about this. And I went home, bought the book. And one of the first things my mother said to me was, don't ever talk to grandma about this. That is her mother. And I said, why not? And she said, because the grief, the pain, the anger that she still carried around was palpable. And that there was a great silence about what happened to Ben Barsky, her oldest son. And so I had to honor that. You know, you have to sometimes honor the silence that people have, honor the pain they're feeling. And so whatever I discovered later on about Ben Barsky came not from the kitchen table, certainly not from my grandmother, or from my mother for that matter, who was only 17 when he went to Spain. It came from my own digging into resources, archives, and so on. We'll talk more about those later. But it was a very, very personal moment for me. The flip side of that is that these two cousins of my dad's, Joe and Leo Mendelowitz, also known as Joe and Leo Gordon, that was their nom de guerre. Joe Gordon was one of the first Americans to go to Spain in December 1936, kind of larger than life character. His brother Leo went the next year in 1937. And in 1975, by which time I was in graduate school already, my Aunt Gussie, my dad's sister, came up to me one day. I was at her house in Goldensbridge, bungalow colony in New York one summer. And she handed me an old cigar box that was full of these handwritten letters that the two brothers had written from Spain. And she sort of entrusted them to me. And I felt a tremendous sense of obligation and also responsibility to do something with these letters. And they were really eye-opening.
Wow.
So those are two moments in the bookstore and in my aunt's house, getting these letters in which the Spanish Civil War all of a sudden began to take on real life for me. I really began to think about these things, and I was able to actually, read these letters written in the trenches. I was able to ask questions about Ben Barsky, and so I went from there.
That's amazing. That is so cool. I do have my mother's letters that are in Spanish from her family. She came in 1958. Her mom died in 70. Her dad died in 77. So there's, sort of should be 20 years worth of plus years worth of letters. And yet there's very few. And as I was flipping, I've read them many, many times, but I sort of was looking at them with different eyes this past weekend. And one of the things I realized about my grandfather Raphael's letters is that the signature is very consistent on this handful of letters, but it's clear that somebody is doing the writing for him because every letter is in a different penmanship, which I hadn't quite put together because they're in Spanish. And so I have to read them super slow, but I was like,
he was not literate.
Yeah, I think, some marginal literacy issues are happening. And then I have one letter that seems to be written in the handwriting of, it's signed by it's the only letter I have that's signed by my grandmother, my grandfather, and my mother's youngest brother. So it says, Carmen, Rafael, y Pepin, my Uncle Pepe. And it's in pencil. And the handwriting is, it's like a fourth grader. I mean, it's like really, they're struggling. They're really struggling to get these letters written. And so that was just a kind of a reminder, right? That not only had my mother gone functionally a million miles away to a place they would never see, but communication was not that they couldn't really, they didn't have a telephone. They were very poor. My mother's family did not have a telephone. Remember how you used to pay per call in the old days when you had landlines? It was unthinkably expensive to call. So here's this terrible news of my grandmother's death, and it's written by a third party, and it comes 3 weeks later, and so the time lag is just, it was really eye-opening. And then I got my grandfather Raphael's letter, and then my mother's sister's letter. Rafaela, her sis, writes to my mom in the summer, and it's clear from this letter that my mother has asked her, how long does she need to wear el luto? How long does she need to wear mourning clothes to mark their mother's death? And there's probably other things in that letter, but Rafaela responds to this question with very salty, very pointed language. She says, Carmen, you asked me how, this is my translation, Carmen, you asked me how long does one have to wear el luto? I'll tell you that I'll wear it for 2 years, but you don't have to wear it because el luto is a joke. Wearing it serves nothing, but here we're so silly, we have no other remedy than to wear el luto. Wearing it does not make me feel mother more. I know that no one in the US wears it, so you do not have to. What you have to do is not forget mother ever. Such a powerful statement. And, I think what I hear in this letter is a lot of compassion for my mother in a way, right?
Yes.
Trying to relieve her of this burden, right? I will carry this burden. And yet what's unstated in this half correspondence is my mother's desperate need to mark this death and her struggle to make it real, right? How is she supposed to grieve? How is she supposed to mourn? And it just, surfaced another whole round of poignancy around this loss and around the erasure of her mother, the loss of her mother. And I can tell you, when my mother passed in 2018, she was still living in that same house I grew up in Peekskill, New York. I'm out here in Portland. And let me tell you, when you lose your mother in a community where no one knows your mother, that's a thing.
Yeah.
That's a thing. So there's this added level of unreality, right? That I think really, frankly, plunged her into depression for some years. I mean, it makes a lot of things look differently now that I have appreciation for the magnitude of this loss and the inability to really grieve it in a culturally coherent way.
Listening to you talk, Patty, about this, there are two things that I wanted to sort of put in here that come to my mind. One is that, and I'm very conscious of this, when you use the term memoir or you talk about family history, my family included no celebrities, no famous authors, no influential leaders. And when we talk about the Spanish Civil War in particular, there's a kind of romance about the war. It's maybe
sure.
not the right word, but it's certainly there. But many people know some of the famous writers, George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway, Martha Gellhorn. These were all people that wrote about Spain and covered it as correspondents. There were any number of political leaders who've talked about it. And yet the history of your family and the history of my family it needs to be recognized as part of the historical record as well. History is not just about famous people, not just about powerful people, and I think both of us are very cognizant of that. The other thing that comes out for me in your work, and I think in mine as well, is that the Spanish Civil War was unquestionably the most ideological war of the 20th century. That is to say, people motivated by ideas, by ideology, by political beliefs. That there's never been a war, it seems to me, in the 20th century that had that. And yet, part of my goal was to strip away the ideology and to not sort of focus on, what resolution was passed at what party Congress or what some government decided to do or not do, I was interested in getting at these people as full human beings, flawed, in many cases, badly flawed, and in some other cases, just incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And it raises also the question of what sacrifice means, not just for those of us remembering and trying to honor people, but also what sacrifice meant at that time.
Right.
What did it mean for somebody to go to Spain to volunteer? What did it mean for their families back home?
Yeah.
What did it mean for the pregnant girlfriend who was left behind?
Right.
And so, in these ways, I think that both of us are trying to complicate what people think they know about the Spanish Civil War, and about the struggle against fascism more broadly.
Right. Well, I think so well said. I think my family's story is Exhibit A for a small but I think important literature. It's on the academic side that says one of the most important legacies of the war is the way that the poor sort of were doubly victimized, right? That
Mhm.
they their losses at the battlefield were higher than other groups, and also the impact of the loss of life and also the starvation, the disease, the other stressors that come with war really hit poor people at a much greater magnitude than other groups. And this is my favorite book on this is by a guy named Antonio Sanchez Cazorla. He teaches in Canada and he's from Almeria. And my family is case in point of that. In fact, most of the stories of the Spanish Civil War, as were told to me at my kitchen table, are not about combat. They're about hunger. They're about food and trying to stay alive and who has access to food. And so the ideological divide in my family, let's just say, I mean, the simplest way to put it is my grandfather Rafael, my mother's father, and his father-in-law, my grandmother's dad, who was a collaborator with the Falange. In my great-grandfather's house, there was food. In my grandfather's house, they ate orange peels and scavenged at the railroad stations for coal to keep themselves warm. So it's about who has the ability to stay alive, and be able to
Remind
eat.
our listeners who the Falange were.
The Falange was the fascist party that consolidates in the 30s and comes to power after
Yes.
1939.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
I think
eating orange peels and sort of and just hunger. There's a story about, well, my mother's baby sister died of pneumonia. My grandmother had three pregnancies. My mom, her sister, who I've already referred to, and then the twins. She had twins in 1941 at the height of El Hambre. And the baby girl died, and Pepin, my uncle Pepe, he lived, but his sister died, and he and the family, he was sort of medically malnourished. He had a bloated belly and was very ill, and the family was sent to a Red Cross camp to kind of recover. And the family story, I never really explored this much back in the day when everybody was still alive, but the story was that my grandfather was an anarchist. But I have nothing to hang this ideological orientation on in terms of party platforms or any kind of activism. I just know that he was a poor man. He was probably marginally literate, though he could write his name. He had a very low-level job. He was kind of a yard man at the barracks of the Civil Guard, so he had a very marginal living. And the only other piece of that is that my mother and he used to argue a lot. And not surprisingly, my mother, wanted schooling, and one of the ways the Falange held out goodies for cooperation was they had a lot of clubs for young people, right? It's the only place you could get a little enrichment, you could see, you could get books out of a library, you could have a study club. And because my mother was taken out of school at 12 because they were so poor and hungry, my mother had to go to work, so she never finished her education. Anyway, just totally to your point, that anarchism in my mother's family is just this marker. It's very it's hard to narrativize because it never really was.
It's kind of abstract.
It's abstract, and and also kind of like communism. You're not really allowed to talk about it after some point. It exists, but you're not supposed to. By the way,
Right.
did I ever tell you when I worked at Hunter? I taught at Hunter College for a year in the 90s. I loved it, and I actually was up for the tenure job there. I wish I had gotten it, but it wasn't to be. But when I was filling out my documents to teach at Hunter, they actually asked me to sign an anti-communist affidavit.
Loyalty oath. Yeah. Yeah. Well, those things are still around.
They also said I didn't have to sign it, but I thought you'd appreciate hearing that.
Yeah.
So communism and anarchism are there, but you're not allowed to talk about it.
That's right.
It's silence. It's one of those silences you mentioned.
Certainly when we talk about the Spanish Civil War on the American side, and people always wonder and sometimes ask me, what possessed these, almost 3,000 people to go over there, pick up a gun. In many cases, in most cases, these are people who never fired a gun in their life,
Untrained,
but they felt compelled to go. And one of the things I think is very clear, and this is probably true in Europe writ large as well, is that there's no way that you can separate Spanish Civil War, and particularly the volunteers who went to fight, from other world historic events. Most importantly, in my view, the Great Depression and the rise of fascism. And so that the people who went to Spain, by and large, were already politically committed people. Many of them were communists, but not all of them. But the larger point is that for most of these folks, going to Spain was on a continuum with a bunch of other political activism that they had been involved in. Union organizing, pit line confrontations, struggle against racism, the attempt to beat back fascism, not only in Europe but also in the United States.
Right.
My dad's family grew up in Yorkville on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which was the national center of the German-American Bund, which was a pro-Nazi group that was very strong in New York and elsewhere in the United States. And when you listen to people recounting stories of going to school while watching a parade of swastika-bearing Nazis in uniform marching down Second Avenue, this was not some abstract philosophical threat. Fascism was a real thing in the streets. Particularly for Jews, of course, this was something that was quite important.
Amazing.
And I know that we can get into this later. That all the three people in my family that went to Spain were all dedicated communists. They had all had experience different ways, in political struggle. And Spain was for them simply just another part, another feature, another aspect of their political activism. And these were people who I think were shaped by the Great Depression, by, as you point out, hunger, deprivation, a sense of no future, and I think that's critical for understanding the motivations of why people went.
Yeah, I just finished Rachel Maddow's book Prequel, and it was chillingly reminded. The book does a great job of knitting together some of these. They look like little isolated hotspots, but they're not.
Oh.
And the New York parts of the story are just riveting, just compelling. And I like to say, and I believe it's the narrative that I think I can own at doing this book and finishing my research, although in some ways my book is the prequel to my family's story, since it's the village that my grandmother grew up in. It goes through the war, but my great-grandfather doesn't sort of come to power, if you will, until 1939. So that's maybe the next book I'll do. But I feel like my mother left Spain to escape fascism. Yet it's not because fascism was a left or right wing ideology. It's that fascism was destroying her family.
Yes.
In the sense that the deprivation, the lack of choices, my mother's thirst for education in a culture that remanded women to motherhood and marriage. My mother was a marriage resistor. She didn't want to get married and
I
didn't
never
want.
heard that term before. I love that. Marriage
Yeah, she was
resistant.
well, she wouldn't have used it, right? And this is part of what we struggle with as both family members and scholars, to find a language that really captures all the, can name all these silences. So she used to say to my sister and me, oh, I didn't want to marry Jose Antonio because he had a missing fingernail on one thumb, and he had this like weird stubby thumb, and it creeped her out. But the fact of the matter is, if you, in 1950s Spain, if you're a respectable Catholic girl of marriageable age, and you are given a respectable marriage offer, you're expected to take it.
Right. You're
And
suspect if you don't, right?
you're absolutely suspect if you don't. And so my mother was looking at a situation where she said she would have been a criada. She would have been a caretaker in her sister's home or her father's home at first. She didn't want that life. She had wangled a job at the university. She was a lab tech at the University of Córdoba, and was, hanging out with educated people. My mother was very bright, although she had been taken out of school at 12, but ultimately could not make a viable life for herself as a working woman. And though my grandfather Raphael was an anarchist, I think some of the scholarship bears this out, that anarchism, didn't always hold great promise for women, because it kind of there was no check, there was no other without the state, there's no other check on what's going on in families and communities. And if it's a free for all, women are often going to be at the sort of mercy of the men in the nearest proximity to their lives. And so anarchism was not not just completely kind of illegal, but not attractive for my mother. And yet, of course, the regime is killing them too. So is it a choice? Is it pressure?
Right.
It's hard to really characterize, but the story she tells is of how you had to apply for this visa, right? And you had to go to like indoctrination school. You had to learn. There was Richard Wright writes about this in Pagan Spain. There's a booklet that you have to memorize about Spanish history and the Falange and who Franco is, and you have to be sort of indoctrinated. And
Catechism.
that was kind of disconcerting. And the other thing that she said was out and out scary was you were investigated. She had someone follow her. There was somebody following her for weeks as her application was sort of going through the pipeline. So there's this real intimidation factor in her actual departure from the country. So I own the narrative, as I said a minute ago, that my mother left Spain to escape fascism, but her narrative is a fractured story about her family not really being able to feed her, coming nearly, frankly, to blows with her own father about living as a kind of independent working woman in her household where there was no space for young women to do that. She's a marriage resistor. So it's a bumpy story about how my mom gets here, and not easy to narrate in simple terms.
There's a great quote from Alva Bessie, who was a Spanish Civil War veteran, of course, was a well-known screenwriter later on with one of the Hollywood 10. And in his 1939 book, actually the memoir, Men in Battle, Story of Americans in Spain, he said the following: men went to Spain for various reasons, but behind almost every man I met was a common restlessness, a loneliness. In action, these men would fight like devils with the desperation of an iron-bound conscience. In private conversation, there was something else again. The need
Beautiful.
to get beyond ideology and the need to look at people as individuals. And something else that popped into my head while you were talking, Patty, is this: that we often say that the past is a different country, it's a different planet. It's one of the hardest things for students to understand, that things in 1936, were quite different than they are in 2024. And the deeper I got into these stories, the more I realized how different, that planet really was. And also, the more I realized that the individuals we're talking about were individuals. And so the circumstances were quite difficult. My dad's two cousins, Joe and Leo Gordon, their mother died when they were like 15 and 13 in 1930. And they came to live with my father's family in Yorkville. And he remembers, one of them, Leo, working in a salami factory and then coming into the bed at night reeking of garlic and grease and all the stuff from the factory.
Wow.
And meanwhile, my dad's mother, my grandmother, who I never knew, the death of her sister, that was their mother, came just a few months after the death of her husband, my
Ugh,
grandfather. And you think
wow.
about, well, you lose your husband and your sister in a 5 or 6 month period. In some ways, inconceivable to me.
Yeah.
But Joe and Leo Gordon were both tough working class kids. They were street kids. And one of the things that comes through in these letters, the letters begin in this cross country trip they took in 1931. They traveled across the country. These are teenagers
Amazing.
bumming their way to California, writing these incredibly vivid letters, which we'll get to later on, and taking jobs wherever they could. Uh, and they later wound up in the CCC camps, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Both of them were labor organizers. Joe was an organizer for the Communist Party, which I'll get into later on. But the contrast with my mother's brother, Ben Barsky, again, instructive. He was um, a student at CCNY, City College. He played music. He was clearly an intellectual of sorts. He wanted to be a teacher. And in one of the letters I have describing him, one of his friends describes him as a gentle soul.
No.
And you ask yourself, how did this guy, pick up a
Right.
gun?
Right.
And so within my family, just my family, I have, it seems to me that the two sides of a kind of Jewish radicalism. One is the sort of the working class street kid tough side, and the other is the sort of more intellectual, aspirational side of somebody who wants to be a teacher. And they're very, very different, but they both wind up in the same struggle. And again,
Amazing.
I think we have an obligation as historians to honor those differences, try to understand them as best we can. But again, that requires going beyond ideology and into the very sort of human aspect of what they were doing.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of ironies too. My mother's family had fled an anti-Semitic pogrom in Ukraine in 1919. They traveled around Poland for a couple of years. They finally wound up on Ellis Island in 1923. And my grandfather was a leather tanner. He used to tan leather and he would sell it to shoemakers and other people. He was it's a classic Jewish middleman sort of business. But they were no fans of the Bolsheviks. They had their store appropriated at some point. They were not revolutionaries in any sense. And yet, three of their kids, Ben and two of their daughters, including my mother, both wind up as dedicated active communists in the 1930s in America. So how do you square that with the
Amazing.
circumstances and the experiences of the parents? It's very, very tough. No easy
It's
answers to these things.
no easy answers. Wow.
Yeah,
Again, the layers are so challenging, because my Spanish relatives really project this like American dream narrative onto my mother's story,
yeah,
which is hard for me to challenge for many reasons. Why would I burst their bubble? There's no real need to do that. Also, my Spanish isn't quite good enough, I think, to do that with subtlety and with nuance and a light touch. Um, but in fact, what thinking of my mother as a remittance worker, in other words, we talk in the 21st century about sort of Filipinas and other groups, particularly from around the Asian, Pacific hub and diaspora as being today's remittance workers. Well, my mother wasn't an Ellis Island immigrant. My mother was a remittance worker. Those are two
right,
different orientations toward an immigration
right,
story. And another letter that I bumped into in the collection I looked at was the woman. She had traveled with a friend or made a friend, I should say, on the boat coming over in 58, a woman named Paquita, Francisca, who lived in Seville. And this woman is writing my mother a letter saying, can we really be friends across all these miles? I'm so bored. And here you are in America. And can we really stay in touch? She's typed this letter. This is a very, she's really reaching, she's reaching for something through this relationship with my mother. Like she's stuck in fascist Spain, and my mother's living the American dream.
Right.
So again, a lot of people on the Spain side project this American dream narrative onto my mother. And yet when I was digging around the attic, finding these letters a few years ago when my mom got sick, what did I find? I found a very fancy document in Spanish with ribbons, a very official looking legal document with signatures and stamps and seals. And I'm like, it's some sort of court document. I'm rifling through this. I have my two kids on either side. Maria and Chapin are with me. We're sort of looking at this. Their Spanish is better than mine. So, I have no business being the lead PI on this. But anyway, it turns out this is a document executed in Chihuahua, Mexico in April of 1963, issuing my mother a quickie divorce from some guy named Rocco Tedesco, who she had married in 19, I can't even remember what the date is, like probably 1959 or 60, to stay in the country. So not only was my mother a remittance worker, but she was one of these, quote unquote, terrible immigrants who just gets a marriage to stay in the country. My mother was sort of a lawbreaker, right? She's doing these sort of some semi-untoward things. And of course, I am 50 years old at that point, and I'm learning that my mother had a first marriage before she married, and I'm the oldest. That she married some other guy before my dad. I mean, they had kept this completely quiet from us. My dad knew, because they got married they got the divorce in April. The marriage was in June, and I was around 9 months later to the day. But again, just complicating these immigrant narratives, particularly growing up in New York. I mean, there's so much heavy nostalgia and active, myth making around Ellis Island and all this sort of huddled masses, and it's all very heroic and but it hides so much. It hides so much. And my mother was sort of really struggling to figure out what's next.
Yes, it's striking to me how in the popular culture and popular discourse, there is this kind of romantic immigrant narrative, and the images that you see, that people see on TV from uh, uh, documentary footage of Ellis Island, whatever. It always presents these people as children, it seems to me. And what you realize is, I mean, who in your family too. I mean, my mother's family came to Ellis Island in 1923. They were middle-aged. They were 35 and 36 years old. They had 5 kids. And they weren't immigrants, they were refugees. Very important distinction, seems to me.
Right.
But they were fully formed as adults. They had their families, they had their life sort of viewpoints on life. My father's family too, coming from Hungary. They had a kid already. They were married. They were not these sort of like huddled masses.
Waifs.
People come over with blankets over their head and
Right.
sort of they're ignorant, and all of a sudden they come to America and they become Americans and like that. So I think it's what you're saying is really important for complicating what we think about immigration. I will say that the current discourse on immigration, has gone the opposite way, in which we have the demonizing of immigrants at the southern border. I mean, I look at those pictures at the southern border today, and I see Ellis Island. I see people who are coming to better themselves, maybe fleeing poverty, maybe fleeing political oppression, violence, and so on. And I'm hard pressed to understand why it is that we now have this attitude toward immigrants. I think a lot of it has to do with race, frankly.
Right.
But there were racial issues back in the early 20th century too.
Absolutely.
So to the extent that we both can complicate,
Yeah.
and sort of deepen our understanding of quote unquote the immigrant experience, I think this is very valuable. Because one of the things that I'm sure you wrestled with too, Patty, was you're doing this stuff on your family and relatives and so on, but you don't want to sentimentalize it. You don't want to make it into just a sentimental journey. And that was one of the things that was important to me, to try to look at this, unsentimentally, including
Absolutely.
looking at things that people did that were not so great.
Right.
And, you know,
Well, it's interesting. It's so well put. My mother joined a household that my great granduncle Teodosio had established when he had come in 1920. He did land at Ellis Island, but again, not for particularly romantic reasons. It was not a pogrom, but he literally left at the height of the most important strike, coal mining strike in the village where
right.
his niece, my grandmother, would eventually be born. And so May 1920, I mean, there are 20,000 people on strike. Most of the men have melted into the land, back into the rural areas. It's women and children who are left in town. And so here's my relative, Teodosio. He's 17 years old. He leaves with another guy who's 20, and they're both miners. That's what it says on the ship's manifest. And so they've abandoned the town at the height of the strike, which is eventually successful just a few weeks later. So it's just an interesting moment where these young people are struggling to, I think, read the tea leaves. I mean, this could go one way or the other. It's not clear
Right.
where it's going to go in the middle of May. It's literally on May 20th, literally the day that there's a shootout in Matewan, West Virginia, where 7 people are shot
Yes.
in the shootout between the union reps and the company goons. Is May 20th is literally the day my grandmother is baptized in Pueblonuevo.
Wow.
And Teodosio makes for the hills. And there's a gap there. I don't know exactly why he left.
Excuse me,
But
they were not on strike themselves, were they?
Oh, yes, they were.
Oh,
So
they
what
were on
was
strike.
happening? Oh, yeah. So
Okay.
it's coterminous. It's that same
Okay.
tumultuous 1920. It's global. It's a global moment. And so best I can tell is I think there's labor recruiters, as there almost always is in these major industrial conflicts, who are trying to pick off workers. And a number of people actually end up in West Virginia from Pueblo Nuevo. And there's an article about this in a recent anthology on, again, the invisible Spanish immigrants to the United States. Why are they so invisible? Well, lots of reasons I won't go into here, but my short version is my grandmother's village became a small supplier of skilled industrial workers that were part of the bulge, right, of European immigration that was in part capitalism recruiting, looking for bodies, right? And I think
Exactly.
my young great uncle was just sort of flipped a coin. I was like, well, am I going to stick it out here? Maybe try my luck somewhere else. I think probably lured by some of these labor recruiters. And the papers say people were being recruited away to as far as California at the time.
Yeah, it turns out West Virginia was a fairly cosmopolitan place. I mean, probably more cosmopolitan back then than it is now.
And multilingual, like could have rivaled
That's
Brooklyn,
one, yeah,
could have
yeah,
rivaled the Upper East
yeah.
Side. I forgot about Yorkville. Gosh.
Yeah.
So is that like in the 90s?
Yeah, the 80s and 90s.
80s and
The
90s.
capital, the headquarters of the Bund was on, I think it was East 86th Street. So it was right there. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was a very mixed neighborhood. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, all kinds of people.
Very interesting. Well, my granduncle, rather, Teodosio, establishes a household in White Plains, New York, of all places. And then he works his entire life as the boiler man at an elementary school. So he's kind of the guy
Good
in
job.
the basement
That was a
stoking
good job, actually.
stoking the heat. Yeah, well, and of course it's freezing, so they got to have the boiler running most of the school year. And then my mother lands in this household and starts working in a button shop that Teodosio's wife had set up. My mother was an expert seamstress. When she was taken out of school at 12, she went to a convent by day to work sewing lace, doing fine needlework, as was pretty typical for a girl of her age and class at the time. So she was always great with the needle. My sister and I had beautiful matching outfits our whole life growing up, but she worked in a button shop and sent money home for the next till my grandfather died in 1977.
Yeah, there's an old saying. I mean, this obviously applies not just to Jews, but the Irish came with a pick and shovel. the Jews came with a needle and thread, because so many of them worked in the garment trades and tailoring and so on.